The first lie wasn't spoken. It lived in the pause. That tiny, almost invisible hesitation between the moment my wife asked me if I was okay and the moment I answered. That was where it started. Not with words. With silence, with calculation. With the strange, sick realization that if I tilted my head slightly downward and rubbed my forehead long enough before answering, she softened immediately. Every time. Long day, she asked. I remember the exact sound of the faucet running behind her while she stood at the kitchen sink. Water hitting metal. Hollow. Rhythmic. The apartment lights were too dim because one bulb above the dining table had been flickering for weeks, and neither of us replaced it. It pulsed every few seconds. Not enough to notice consciously, just enough to make the room feel unstable. I stood near the hallway with my jacket still on. My hand tightened around my work bag, and in that microscopic pause before answering, I saw something happen in her face. Concern, not love. Concern was different. Concern lowered her shoulders. Love expected things. Concern forgave them. Yeah, I said quietly. Just tired, the words slid out gently. Controlled, measured, exhausted enough to be believable without sounding dramatic. She nodded immediately. Immediately, no question. No irritation about the late hour. No comment about dinner getting cold. No mention of the bills stacked beside the microwave. Just softness. Oh, she whispered. Okay, then she turned the water off. And something inside me noticed that. Not emotionally, mechanically. Like some hidden part of my brain was recording data. Pressure applied. Response observed. I hated myself the moment I recognized it, but not enough to stop. Because the truth was I wasn't struggling. Not really. Not financially. Not professionally. Not in the way she thought. The company I told her was downsizing had actually promoted me 3 months earlier. Consulting work I described as temporary contract stuff had become a private equity position that paid more money than I'd ever imagined making before 40. The exhausted version of me she saw every night was partially real. I was tired, but not from failure. From maintaining the architecture of failure. And once the structure existed, once she believed it, I couldn't stop studying it. Couldn't stop studying her. The apartment smelled faintly like garlic and detergent. She walked past me and touched my arm carefully, like I might break. That touch stayed under my skin longer than it should have. Not because it felt good, because it felt earned through deception. You should eat, she said. I nodded, but I watched her while she moved around the kitchen. Watched the subtle changes. She no longer looked at me directly when discussing money. She spoke more gently now, more patiently, like grief had entered the marriage quietly and she was trying not to disturb it. And the horrifying thing, the thing I never admitted even to myself, was that some part of me preferred this version of her. Not because she was kinder, because she was finally careful with me. For years before this, everything between us had carried friction. Tiny cut, tiny disappointment. Kind marriages accumulate silently. She corrected me too quickly in conversations. She interrupted when she thought she already understood what I meant. She sighed when I forgot things. She treated my ambition like an adolescent phase that would eventually burn itself out. Nothing catastrophic, just erosion. Death by atmosphere. Then the struggle started. And suddenly she listened. Suddenly my moods mattered. Suddenly she watched my face when I came home. It should have made me feel love. Instead, it made me feel sick. Because every improvement in our marriage came attached to the image of me becoming smaller, weaker, more dependent. I sat at the table while she reheated dinner. The microwave hummed. The flickering bulb pulsed again. On, off, on. You hear anything back today? She asked carefully. There it was. That tone. Careful. As if my ego had become some unstable object she needed to transport without dropping. I looked down at the table before answering. Another performance. Another tiny delay. No, I muttered. Not technically a lie. I'd received 3 calls that day. One from Singapore. One from New York. One from a firm in London asking if I'd consider relocating within 18 months. I stared at the wood grain of the table while guilt crawled slowly through my chest like cold oil. She placed the plate in front of me. Pasta. Overcooked. The sauce too salty. I almost told her. The truth rose halfway into my throat with terrifying force. I almost said, I'm not failing. I'm succeeding faster than I know how to process. I'm scared of what happens if you know that. I'm scared the softness disappears. I'm scared you only know how to love me when I'm damaged. But then she sat across from me and looked at me with that fragile expression again. And I realized something worse. I didn't know if I wanted the truth anymore either. That realization hollowed me out. Because once deception stops feeling temporary, it stops feeling like deception. It becomes architecture, routine, identity. You'll figure it out, she said quietly. I nodded, but the pressure behind my ribs tightened. Figure what out? My imaginary collapse. My fake instability. My fabricated inadequacy. I took a bite of pasta. Too much salt. I chewed slowly while the bulb flickered overhead again. And suddenly I had the overwhelming sensation that the apartment itself knew. That the walls had absorbed months of half-truths and swallowed conversations and financial theater until the entire place felt structurally dishonest. The bedroom especially. The bedroom had become unbearable. Because every night she touched me differently now. Gentler. As if she feared rejection. As if my masculinity had become injured somehow. And every time she wrapped herself against me in bed, every time her fingers moved slowly across my chest like she was trying to soothe something wounded, I felt an almost unbearable split inside myself. Part of me wanted to confess everything immediately. The other part wanted to disappear deeper into it. Because there was relief inside invisibility. Relief inside lowered expectations. When people think you're struggling, they stop demanding things from you. They stop competing with you. Stop resenting you. Stop measuring themselves against you. They pity you instead. And pity, God pity, is dangerously close to tenderness sometimes. That night after dinner, she fell asleep on the couch beside me. The television glowed silently against the dark apartment. Some crime documentary neither of us was watching. I sat very still. Her head rested against my shoulder. Her breathing slow, warm, trusting. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. And for a while, everything looked normal. But internally, something had already begun decomposing. Because secrets don't stay contained, they expand. They leak into posture, into tone, into timing. You start monitoring yourself constantly. Every reaction becomes edited. I couldn't mention certain restaurants anymore because they were too expensive for the version of me she believed existed. I couldn't suggest vacations. Couldn't replace my watch after she noticed the cracked face. Couldn't explain why money never fully disappeared despite my employment situation. So I built explanations. Consulting leftovers, savings, careful budgeting, each lie requiring structural support from another. And the worst part, she believed me because she wanted to. That realization hurt more than suspicion would have. Around midnight, she stirred slightly against my shoulder. You coming to bed, she murmured sleepily. In a minute, she nodded without opening her eyes. Then quietly, I'm proud of you, the words entered me like glass. Not because they were kind, because they were undeserved. I stared at the television screen while something deep inside my chest shifted painfully out of alignment. Proud of what? My resilience, my persistence, my dignity during hardship. I had manufactured the hardship, curated it, managed it like a controlled burn. And now her admiration sat on top of it like flowers placed on a grave that didn't contain a body. After she went to bed, I remained on the couch for nearly an hour, not moving. The apartment felt airless, every sound amplified. The refrigerator compressor, pipes in the walls, rainwater slipping through gutters outside. I rubbed my hands together slowly, and for the first time, a thought emerged clearly enough for me to hear it fully. I didn't know how to stop. Not because confessing was impossible, because confession would destroy the emotional ecosystem we'd adapted to. If I suddenly revealed success, what would that mean? That I'd manipulated her, tested her, observed her. No explanation sounded sane. No explanation sounded forgivable. I finally stood and walked toward the bedroom. The hallway seemed unusually narrow in the dark. Oppressive. The flickering dining light still pulsed behind me. On. Off. On. I entered the bedroom quietly. She was asleep facing my side of the bed, like she'd been waiting. I changed clothes slowly, carefully. and while removing my shirt, my phone vibrated once against the nightstand. A message. I froze instantly. The light from the screen illuminated the room faintly blue. Her eyes didn't open, but my pulse surged so violently I could hear blood inside my ears. I grabbed the phone quickly. It was from Adrian. One sentence. Wire confirmed. Congratulations. I stared at the words, then immediately deleted the message. The damage had already happened internally, because seeing those words in this room felt obscene, like bringing another identity into the marriage physically. I slipped into bed beside her carefully. She shifted unconsciously toward me. Her hand touched my stomach lightly beneath the blanket, and suddenly I felt trapped in a way that had nothing to do with her. It was the role, the version of myself I'd constructed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not sleeping, thinking about how easily people adapt to narrative, especially the ones that protect them emotionally. She needed me to be struggling because it explained the distance that had existed between us for years. It gave shape to the coldness, the silence, the emotional drift. If I was suffering, then none of it was intentional. But if I wasn't, then what had we been doing to each other all this time? Around 3 in the morning, she woke briefly. Still awake, she whispered. Yeah, you're thinking too much again. As if the anxious version of me had always existed. I swallowed slowly. You ever feel like? I started quietly, then stopped. What? I turned my head slightly toward her in the dark. The room was almost completely black, except for faint city light leaking through the curtain. You ever feel like people only understand you when something's wrong with you? Silent. Not empty silent. Thinking silent. Then she exhaled softly. I think people notice pain faster than happiness. The answer disturbed me because it was intelligent. True. Careful. And for some reason that made me resent her briefly. Not rationally. Emotionally. Because she sounded wise inside a lie I created. You notice me more now, I whispered. Her fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. That's not fair, the words came faster now. More dangerous. You do, I'm trying to help you, I know. Then why are you saying it like that? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Or worse, I did know. I wanted her to feel guilty without understanding why. I wanted her to experience confusion. The same confusion eating through me every day. She shifted onto her back. I could feel tension entering the bed physically now. That's not true, she said quietly. But her voice had changed. Less soft, more alert. I stared into darkness. You weren't this patient before. A long silence followed. The rain outside intensified. Water moving down glass in uneven stream. Finally, she spoke again. You think I only care because you're having a hard time. No, I said automatically. Lie. That's what you're implying. I rubbed my eyes hard. Suddenly exhausted. Suddenly angry at both of us. I don't know what I'm implying. Yes, you do. There it was. Pressure. Tiny but sharp. I could feel the conversation becoming dangerous in ways neither of us fully understood. Because beneath the surface discussion sat another conversation entirely. One she didn't know existed. And the imbalance of knowledge made me feel almost nauseous. You've been distant for months, she whispered. Months, not years. Interesting. My chest tightened. You act like I'm fragile now. You are fragile right now. The certainty in her voice hit me strangely. Like she had accepted this version of me completely. No doubt. No suspicion. A fully integrated reality. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. She had probably rebuilt her entire understanding of our marriage around my struggle. Every past argument now looked different to her. Every moment of emotional withdrawal. Every silence. She had retroactively turned me into a wounded man. And she loved wounded men better than proud ones. The thought came suddenly and viciously. Before I could stop it, I turned toward her sharply. What if I wasn't struggling, silent? Real silence this time. Her breathing changed slightly. What if I wasn't? The room felt smaller instantly. She pushed herself up slightly on one elbow. What does that mean? I almost told her. Right there. I could feel it physically. The truth pushing upward through layers of restraint, like something trying to claw out of wet earth. But then fear. Pure fear. Because if I said it now, in this tone, in this atmosphere, it wouldn't sound like honesty. It would sound like cruelty. Like a psychological experiment. I looked away. Nothing, no, now she was fully awake. What does that mean? Forget it, don't do that. Her voice sharpened slightly. Don't say something weird like that and then shut down. Weird. The word echoed unpleasantly. Because she was right. The conversation had become unstable. I sat up slowly, running both hands over my face. I'm tired, that's not an answer, I know. Then answer me. Pressure climbed quietly between us. Not explosive. Dense. I could almost feel the mattress holding it. I just mean. I said carefully. Maybe people become different around weakness. You mean me? I didn't respond. She stared at me in darkness for several seconds, then laughed softly once. Not amusement. Disbelief. That's what this is about. What? You think I respect you less because you lost your job? Lost your job. The phrase landed heavily. I closed my eyes. That's not what I said, but it's what you mean. I could hear hurt entering her voice now. Real hurt. And suddenly guilt flooded me so hard I nearly confessed immediately just to stop. But guilt is strange. Sometimes instead of forcing honesty, it forces deeper concealment. Because once someone starts hurting, confession begins to feel less like truth and more like violence. I'm going to sleep, I whispered. She stared at me for another long moment, then slowly lay back down. But she didn't move toward me again. And that tiny distance in the bed felt catastrophic. I lay awake until dawn, not moving, listening to the changing sounds of the city outside. At some point birds began singing faintly. Garbage truck, traffic, morning. The room slowly turned gray, and beside me my wife slept facing away now. For the first time in months, I stared at the ceiling while exhaustion pressed heavily behind my eyes. Something had shifted, not visibly, but structurally, like a crack forming inside thick ice. And deep down, beneath all the guilt and manipulation and fear, another feeling moved quietly through me. Relief. Because for one brief second during the conversation, I had almost become visible again. Even if it would have destroyed everything. Even if destruction was inevitable anyway. And somewhere inside that realization, inside the terrifying possibility that the marriage itself had adapted to a false version of me, something dark began unfolding slowly. Not freedom, not clarity, something worse. The urge to keep going, to see how far the distortion could stretch before reality tore through it completely. Morning entered the apartment like an intrusion. Not sunlight, pressure. Gray light leaked through the curtains in thin, sick-looking strips that made everything appear colder than it was. The bedroom smelled faintly of dust and fabric softener and the metallic dryness of sleepless air. I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned. My jaw hurt from clenching it for hours. Beside me, Claire was already awake. I knew before I opened my eyes fully because her breathing was different. Controlled. People breathe differently when they're pretending to still be asleep. I stared at the ceiling. The silence between us felt engineered now. Deliberate. Dense with unfinished meaning. Then she finally spoke. You scared me last night. Her voice was soft, but softness can carry accusation more efficiently than anger sometimes. I swallowed slowly. I know another silence. The kind that expands instead of fading. What did you mean? She asked. There it was again. Not curiosity anymore. Persistence. Conversation hadn't ended. It had simply waited through the night. I turned my head slightly toward her. She was sitting upright now against the headboard, knees pulled loosely toward her chest beneath the blanket. Her hair was messy from sleep. One side flattened slightly. The image should have felt intimate. Instead, it made me feel observed. I don't know, I said quietly. You do. Her eyes stayed on me. No aggression. No visible anger. That almost made it worse. Because calm people force honesty differently than angry people do. Anger gives you something to resist. Calmness removes cover. I sat up slowly. The room tilted slightly from exhaustion. You've been treating me differently. That's because you've been different. No, I said automatically. The word came too quickly. Too sharp. I saw it register in her face immediately. Tiny narrowing around her eyes. Not suspicion yet. Recognition. The recognition that something underneath the conversation wasn't aligning properly. I stood and walked toward the bathroom before she could continue. Cowardice. Simple as that. I shut the door harder than necessary, then gripped the sink with both hands and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked convincing. That was the disturbing part. The tired eyes, the tension in my face, the slight hollowness beneath my cheekbones. Months of divided identity had reshaped me physically. I splashed water over my face slowly, cold, sharp, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion another realization surfaced quietly. I no longer knew which version of my behavior was performance and which version had become real. That frightened me more than the lying. Because lies are controllable, identity distortion isn't. When I returned to the kitchen, Claire was making coffee. The machine hissed softly. Steam curled upward through dim morning light. She didn't look at me immediately. "You have that interview today?" she asked. "Interview? The fake interview. Another structure inside the architecture." "Yeah, what time?" "11, she nodded once. Then finally looked at me. "I can come with you afterward if you want." The offer hit me strangely. Not emotionally at first. Practically. Dangerously. Because there was no interview. Only a meeting downtown with investors who believed I was one of the sharpest financial strategists they'd seen in years. My stomach tightened. "That's okay, you sure?" "Yeah, you don't have to do everything alone." There it was again. That carefulness. That soft handling. And suddenly something ugly moved through me. Not anger exactly. Resentment. Because part of me wondered, would she still speak to me this way if she knew I was succeeding? Or would the old friction return immediately? The subtle competition. The tiny dismissals. The thought was poisonous. And worse, I believed it. I took the coffee from her carefully. Our fingers brushed. She hesitated. Then asked quietly, "Do you think I look down on you?" The question landed with terrifying precision. I stared at her. Really stared at her. And for a second I saw how exhausted she looked too. Not physically. Emotionally. Like she'd been walking carefully around invisible fractures for months. "No," I lied. Her face shifted almost imperceptibly. Because she knew it was a lie. Maybe not the larger lie. But this one. "You do," she whispered. I looked away first. That was answer enough. The apartment suddenly felt much too small. Flickering dining light buzzed faintly overhead again. On. Off, on. Claire leaned back against the counter. "You know what's weird?" she said quietly. I didn't answer. "You were easier to reach before everything fell apart." My chest tightened. Fell apart. The fictional collapse had become shared history now. "You think I changed after I lost my job," I said carefully. "You changed before that." The sentence entered the room and stayed there. Heavy. Still. Because she was right. The deception had started before the narrative itself. Before the fake layoff. Before the financial stories. It started when I realized success made me lonely. When promotions changed the way people looked at me. When friends became quieter around me. When coworkers smiled with their mouths instead of their eyes. When Claire started saying things like, "You don't always have to prove something," or "You're obsessed lately," or the worst one, "I miss when you were simpler, simpler." As if ambition had contaminated me somehow. I remembered every one of those moments with horrifying clarity now. Not because they destroyed me individually. Because together they formed a pattern. A slow emotional conditioning. Success created distance. Weakness created intimacy. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it everywhere. "I'm trying," I muttered. Claire stared at me for a long time. Then nodded slowly. But there was uncertainty in her face now. Tiny. Almost invisible. Still it existed. And once suspicion exists inside a relationship, even in microscopic form, the atmosphere changes permanently. I left the apartment 30 minutes later. The hallway outside smelled faintly of wet concrete and someone's burned toast drifting through another unit. The elevator hummed quietly as it descended. I stared at my reflection in the metal doors. Two versions of myself existed simultaneously now. The struggling husband, the rising executive, and somewhere in the middle the actual person had started dissolving. Outside, the city looked washed out from overnight rain. Cars hissed through wet streets. People moved under umbrellas. Gray clouds hung low between buildings. I walked 3 blocks before realizing my breathing felt shallow. Too fast. My chest tightened strangely. Not panic exactly. Pressure. Like my nervous system no longer trusted reality itself. Because every interaction required active psychological management now. Every conversation involved calculation. What version of me exists in this room? What details are safe? What emotional tone matches the fiction? Even my posture changed unconsciously, depending on who I was with. By the time I reached the office tower downtown, I already felt exhausted. The lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive cologne. A woman at the front desk smiled immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Vale, Mr. Vale. Recognition, respect, competence." The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt surreal. Because less than an hour earlier, I'd been discussing imaginary unemployment over weak coffee beneath a flickering bulb. Now men in tailored suits shook my hand like I mattered. The psychological transition was becoming violent internally, like tearing skin repeatedly. Inside the conference room, Adrian grinned when he saw me. "There he is," he stood and adjusted his cufflink. "You look terrible. I didn't sleep. That's usually what happens when people triple their net worth in a quarter." He laughed lightly. "I didn't." The room overlooked the city through enormous glass windows. Rain streaked softly downward outside. Everything inside the room felt controlled, stable, powerful, and suddenly I hated it. Not because anything was wrong, because it felt more artificial than the apartment. At least the suffering at home carried emotional texture. This place felt antiseptic, predatory. Adrian studied my face more carefully now. "You okay?" I nodded automatically. Then stopped, because for the first time in months, someone had asked me that question without pity, and I realized I no longer knew how to answer it honestly. The mating blurred. Voices, numbers, forecasts, expansion models. At some point, someone congratulated me again. Another hand on my shoulder, another smile. But internally, I felt detached from all of it, like my consciousness was lagging slightly behind reality, watching itself, monitoring itself. I kept seeing Claire in the kitchen. "You were easier to reach before everything fell apart," the sentence repeated endlessly. Because maybe she had sensed this fracture forming long before the deception began. Maybe success itself had altered me more than I admitted. Maybe I'd started performing exhaustion emotionally long before I performed it financially. Around noon, my phone vibrated. "Claire." I stared at the screen too long before answering. "Hey, hey," her voice sounded strange. "Too measured." "You done already?" Almost silent. "Then, can I ask you something?" My stomach tightened immediately. "Sure." Another pause. Longer this time. "Did you ever want me to feel sorry for you?" The question hit with surgical precision. I stopped walking entirely. People moved around me in the lobby, while cold adrenaline spread slowly through my body. "What? I don't know," she said quickly. "Forget it. No, why would you ask that? Her breathing shifted, and suddenly I heard something underneath her voice. "Not suspicion. Fear." "I feel like I can't reach you anymore," she whispered. The sentence hollowed me out instantly. Because she was telling the truth. Not the truth she thought she was telling. The deeper one. I had become psychologically unreachable. Not because of stress. Because deception splits presence itself. Part of you is always elsewhere managing reality. "Claire, I'm not accusing you of anything." But she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "I just feel." When she stopped. "What?" "I feel like you disappear when I look at you now." My throat tightened painfully. "Disappear." "Yes, exactly." Because maintaining false weakness required constant emotional withdrawal. You can't fully inhabit intimacy while actively manipulating perception. Some essential human coherence breaks, and people feel it even when they can't explain it. "I love you," I said suddenly. Too fast, too intense. Wrong. The silence afterward was devastating, because spontaneous declarations during tension rarely feel reassuring. They feel defensive. Finally, she whispered. Why did that sound like an apology? The lobby suddenly seemed unbearably bright. Every sound too sharp. My pulse pounded violently. Claire'd just come home early tonight, then she hung up. I stood motionless for several seconds. Then longer. Something irreversible had started. Not discovery exactly. Recognition. The human nervous system notices contradiction eventually, even without evidence, especially in love. That evening I sat in my car outside the apartment building for almost 40 minutes. Rain tapped softly against the windshield again. The city lights blurred in wet glass. I couldn't move, because going upstairs meant re-entering the distortion physically. And suddenly I felt exhausted beyond language. Not tired, psychologically worn thin, like my mind had been grinding against itself for too long. I thought about confession, really thought about it, not abstractly, practically. I imagined walking upstairs, sitting across from her, telling her everything. I imagined the expressions, confusion first, then disbelief, then the horrible reconstruction phase where every past interaction would rearrange itself inside her mind. Every comforting touch, every sympathetic conversation, every sacrifice, all poisoned retroactively. No version of the truth preserved us anymore. That realization settled over me slowly, heavily, because the deception was never really about money. It was about emotional permission. I had wanted to know who I was allowed to become inside the marriage. And once weakness produced tenderness, I couldn't emotionally unlearn it. I finally went upstairs. The apartment was quiet when I entered. Too quiet. No television, no music. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the buzzing flicker of that dining light. Claire sat at the table, bills spread in front of her. She looked up immediately when I entered, and something inside me went cold, because her face had changed. Not dramatically, subtly. She was watching me now, actually watching me. "How'd it go?" she asked. I removed my jacket carefully. "Fine, just fine, yeah." Her eyes stayed on me too long. Then she nodded once. I made dinner. The atmosphere felt wrong instantly. Not explosive, controlled. Which was worse? I sat across from her slowly. The pasta tonight was different. Homemade sauce, fresh basil and effort. And somehow that made guilt feel physically painful. She poured wine into my glass. Cheap wine. The kind we'd supposedly switched to after my financial problems. I stared at it, then at her. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Maybe exhaustion finally cracked something open. Maybe pressure simply exceeded capacity. But suddenly the entire structure felt unbearable. Not morally, psychologically. Like I could no longer survive inside divided identity. "Claire," my voice sounded unfamiliar. She looked up immediately. "What?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because the truth, after months of concealment, no longer existed as a single clean statement. It existed as interconnected damage. Where would I even begin? "I'm successful. I lied. I needed you to love me differently." I wanted to know whether weakness was the only version of me you could hold gently. None of it sounded human anymore. It sounded pathological. "What?" she repeated softly. My heart hammered violently. And then cowardice again. I got another interview. The words escaped automatically, reflexively. The moment they left my mouth, I felt something inside myself collapse. Not emotionally, structurally. Because I heard it, the eyes, the fluency. The instinctive preservation of fiction. Claire stared at me silently, too silently. Then she smiled. Small, careful, encouraging. "That's good," but her eyes looked wet suddenly. And for one horrifying second I realized she might already know. Not the detail, not the scale, but enough. Enough to feel grief instead of surprise. "You don't seem happy," she whispered. The room blurred slightly around the edges. I rubbed my forehead hard. "I'm tired." "No," her voice cracked softly. "You always say that." Pressure surged violently now. The apartment itself felt compressed. Flickering bulb buzzed overhead. On. Off. On. Claire stood slowly from the table, and the look on her face terrified me because it contained two incompatible emotions simultaneously. Love and distance. "You know what I think," she said quietly. I couldn't speak. "I think something happened to you a long time ago." My throat tightened. "And I think you decided to disappear instead of letting me see it." The room became completely silent. No refrigerator hum. No traffic outside. Nothing. Just her voice. "You stand next to me every day," she whispered, "but it feels like you're somewhere else entirely." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Because she was right in ways neither of us fully understood. I had disappeared into performance, into resentment, into observation, into the terrifying comfort of being pitied instead of known. Claire looked at me for another long moment, then quietly asked, Are you actually unhappy? The question destroyed me. Because I didn't know. Success hadn't made me happy. Failure was fictional. Love felt conditional. Identity felt unstable. I no longer trusted my own emotional reality enough to answer. And the silence that followed became answer enough anyway. Claire nodded slowly, like she understood something finally. Not the truth, something sadder. That I was unreachable now. She walked past me toward the bedroom quietly. Not angry. That would have been easier. Just tired. At the doorway she stopped briefly without turning around. I miss you, she whispered. Then she disappeared into the dark hallway. I remained at the table alone, the wine untouched, flickering light buzzing overhead endlessly. And for the first time since the lies began, I understood the real damage. It wasn't deception. It was fragmentation. I had divided myself into versions for so long that no single version felt real anymore. The struggling husband wasn't real. The successful man downtown wasn't fully real either. Both were performances orbiting a hollow center. And somewhere during the process, intimacy itself had died quietly. Not because Claire stopped loving me, because I stopped allowing myself to exist consistently enough to be loved honestly. I sat there for hours, not moving. The apartment grew darker slowly around me, and eventually I realized something almost unbearable. I had spent months trying to discover whether my wife loved me differently in weakness than in strength, without realizing I had become impossible to love clearly in either state. Near midnight, the bedroom door opened softly. Claire stood there half hidden in darkness. Are you coming to bed? Her voice sounded distant now. Not emotionally cold, just careful, like someone approaching the edge of deep water without knowing how far it dropped. I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly the urge to confess returned with overwhelming force. Not to save the marriage. That possibility felt gone somehow, but to become singular again. Oh, to stop splitting reality every second of every day. I stood slowly, walked toward her. My chest felt tight enough to crack. She searched my face quietly, waiting. And in that final suspended moment, that terrible, fragile moment where truth still existed as possibility, I realized something devastating. I didn't know whether confession would be honesty anymore. What? Or just another attempt to control how she saw me. The thought stopped everything. Because if even truth becomes contaminated by performance, what part of you remains real? Claire touched my arm gently, the same careful touch from months earlier. But now it felt different, not comforting, funereal, like touching someone already halfway gone. And standing there in the dim hallway light, suspended between revelation and silence, I understood that some psychological fractures do not explode dramatically. They deepen quietly, until eventually two people stand inches apart. One, speaking softly. One, loving each other imperfectly. One, while an invisible distance expands between them, so gradually, neither person can identify the exact moment it became impossible to cross.